And we are live on Facebook. Good evening and welcome to this important webinar hosted by the Pinsker Center. The Pinsker Center is a university-based think tank which facilitates dialogue on topics relating to the Middle East and foreign policy, regularly arranging discussions and briefings such as the one this evening. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, or you can visit our website, pinskercenter.org. The Middle East is a tense and sensitive region of our world, and tensions are particularly high at the present moment. And it is regrettable that the tensions of this region do overspill very often into the discourse and politics of other societies outside the region, especially in Europe. Recently, we have seen repulsive incidents of anti-Semitism and racism in the UK, Austria, Germany, and elsewhere. And at the Pinsker Center, we remain firmly committed in the struggle against intolerance, bigotry, and hatred of all kinds. We also remain firmly committed in our support for peaceful resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and you can find a statement to this effect on our website. Conflict resolution and the road to reconciliation is through dialogue, and that is why it is important to have a discussion such as the one tonight. At the Pinsker Center, we remain firmly committed to objective inquiry and balanced, respectful debate. We welcome engagement from all perspectives, and we welcome the exchange of ideas and healthy, lively disagreement. I hope all these principles are the foundation of the debate this evening, which is very much needed. And on that note, I would like to introduce our speakers this evening, and it's a pleasure to do so. Ben HAYTON, our chair, is a Sergeant Reserve in the Paratrooper Brigade of the Israeli Defense Forces. He is a graduate of University College London, having read for an undergraduate degree in history, and is currently a postgraduate student at IDC Herzliya, one of Israel's leading institutions in the field of political science. And our first speaker for this evening will be Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Kemp is a former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, a leading expert in counter-terrorism, and the former military attaché to the Cabinet Office. He's also a patron of the Pinsker Center, and this is his 12th talk for us over several years, and it is a genuine privilege to have a speaker of his caliber to speak to a university audience. Colonel Kemp has completed 14 tours of operational duty across the globe, including Kuwait, Iraq, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and Afghanistan. He is a prolific commentator on the Middle East and was only this week cited by Israel's Prime Minister on both social media and in briefings to international media. We will then later be joined by Ambassador Dore Gold, an American-Israeli political scientist who has served in many positions, including as an advisor to 2 Israeli prime ministers, as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, and most recently as Director General of Israel's Foreign Service. Ambassador Gold is the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and holds a PhD from Columbia University. And on that note, I'm handing over to Ben HAYTON, and thank you very much everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan, and obviously thank you, Colonel, for joining us once again. I'm going to kick us off with something that most of us have seen on social media, which in the last week we've had skits or news reports from the likes of John Oliver and Trevor Noah. And I think I'll just pick up on the main points of Trevor Noah's comments on the conflict, which with his audience of tens of millions of people have been heard by everyday citizens across the world, including the United Kingdom and of course the United States where he's based. To quote him on his key points, he says, "Let's look at who's dead and who's alive this week. I cannot hear those numbers and see a fair fight. All I'm asking is when you have this much power, what is your responsibility?" So how would you comment or respond to those observations?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here tonight. I've got huge admiration for the Pinsker Center, which does great work, and I would urge anybody listening who's not already signed up to the Pinsker Center to please do so, because it's one of the best ways, I think, of educating ourselves on the situation in the Middle East, which is obviously incredibly complicated. In relation to that quote you gave me, we don't want a fair fight. A fair fight is for the boxing ring. It might be for a football field, something like that. But certainly war is not about being fair. War is about winning. If you actually commit your armed forces to war, you've got to be as unfair as you can be in order to achieve your objective. We don't want to talk about fair fights. At the same time, we do want to fight within the laws of armed conflict. And I think Israel excels at operating in a very tough environment, but within the laws of armed conflict. And it goes, I was a member of a delegation that went to Israel in 2014, made up of mainly of former chiefs of staff and generals, about 10, 12 of us. And we went out there to look at the conflict in 2014. And we came back, and the consensus among those generals was Israel, during the conflict in 2014, adhered scrupulously to the laws of war, and in many cases went well beyond the requirements of the laws of war. In other words, it operated well inside the laws of war. And I'm confident that the same procedures are being applied today, perhaps even more so, perhaps even more scrupulously. So that's, you know, that is essentially the situation we're faced with. You can't say, as I've seen some journalists saying, that Israel is behaving disproportionately because more Palestinians have been killed in Gaza than Jews have been killed in Israel. Proportionality in war has a specific meaning, and I'm going to mention that in a second. And it does not include those kind of statistics. It's tragic that every Palestinian that's died is a tragedy. And it's due entirely to the aggression by their leadership, by Hamas. Those are the people responsible. It's also tragic that every Jew has died, every Jew that has died. But it's not a question of disproportionality. What it's a question of is Israel takes every conceivable step to protect its own people. It has warning system when rockets are inbound, sirens, red alert on the phone, etc. It has shelter systems throughout the country where people can take cover. And I've met people in houses in Israel that have been bombed by Hamas missiles who have survived because they've just managed to make it to their bomb room just in time and close the door before they get blasted. And then they have, of course, they have the Iron Dome, which the Iron Dome is a phenomenal weapon system which provides defense against incoming missiles. And it has had 90% success rate in this particular fight, which is, I think, quite phenomenal. And actually, although the Iron Dome has protected the lives of many Israelis, it's also protected the lives of even more Palestinians. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. And the reason for that is that if these 4,000 plus rockets were coming from Gaza into Israel, and many more of them hit their target than have hit their target, we'd see many more dead Israelis, probably hundreds of dead Israelis. Now, the Israeli government could not tolerate that for a moment. And therefore, rather than carrying out a deliberate, very cautious, carefully planned, carefully targeted campaign, it would have to use much more brutal, blunt force against Hamas. And it would be justified in doing that. It would be justified and it would be legal. But many more civilians would have died. And also, almost certainly, the IDF would have had to go in on the ground as well, which would also have resulted in more civilian deaths, unavoidably, despite all Israel's efforts. So, because Iron Dome has limited the casualties in Israel, it means that Israel has been able to take a much more cautious and careful approach, and has resulted in far fewer civilian deaths in Gaza than otherwise would have occurred. But even if Iron Dome had been 100% successful, and there had been no casualties in Israel, Israel still would have had to react. No country in the world can possibly tolerate thousands of missiles being fired at civilian populations without responding, and responding to kill those people doing it and destroy their weapons. That's what would have to happen. And any country in every country in the world would do that. In 1944, Britain got hit by thousands of German V1 and V2 rockets, which killed lots of people in southern England. How did Britain respond? It didn't say, oh, we better not do anything in case someone's offended. What it did, it sent in thousands of bombers, and they carried out heavy bombing raids against the German missile development factories, the German missile production factories, storage sites, railway lines, roads that were transporting these missiles, and the launch sites. And unfortunately, in that campaign, quite a lot of civilians were also killed. But the priority of any government who has, as Ben said, all that power is to protect and defend its own people with it. And I would say that Israel has done, from what I've seen of the conflict so far, Israel has done the best possible job it could do. No other country could expect more. When you hear, if you hear somebody saying something different and talking about disproportionate casualties, then essentially you're hearing somebody who themselves should share an element of the responsibility for what's happening. The reason for that is simple. Hamas's entire strategy is not based on trying to destroy Israel or kill Israeli civilians. That's not their objective at all. They know they can't. They know they can't beat the IDF. The IDF is far more powerful. So what their strategy is to attack Israel, and they've done it time and time again, attack Israel in order to lure the IDF, force them to carry out counterattacks, which will kill some of their civilians. What Hamas want, and they're the first army in the history of the world that has used the lives of their own civilian population as a weapon of war. They want dead Palestinians. That's what they want. And why do they want it? Because they know that they can translate that into propaganda, which will cause condemnation, vilification, isolation of Israel around the world, in the UN, in the EU, in human rights groups, among university professors, and in the media in particular. And you know, that is their sole purpose, and they succeed at it all the time. And you might ask, well, perhaps Israel shouldn't strike back. Perhaps Israel should avoid striking to avoid civilian casualties. Well, I've explained why that can't happen.
So on this topic of what other nations could do or otherwise would do, we're very fortunate that we have you here with such a wealth of experience in various combat zones. The question sort of jumps to itself, to its own feet. Has the British Army ever dealt with an enemy that resembles Hamas in any way? And if so, how did it do so? And on the basis of this experience, what should or could the Israelis do any different from what they're doing at the moment?
Well, we've been involved in a number of conflicts that involve enemies like Hamas and you know, others who have carried out aggression against Britain. And obviously I'm going to talk now only about recent years. I'm not going to go back into history too far. But for example, the Falkland Islands, 1982, for some of you that is ancient history. For me, I was a serving soldier. I didn't serve in the Falklands, but it seems almost like yesterday. But Argentina invaded the Falklands, showed aggression against British sovereign territory in the Falklands, and Britain reacted by sending a task force thousands of miles south to throw them out again. Simply could not accept that kind of aggression against its territory. No British people had died in that fighting, but it was not only was it necessary to regain British sovereign territory, it was also necessary to send a message around the world that Britain is not going to tolerate this kind of criminal behavior against it, because if it had, that would be a green light for authoritarian regimes everywhere to do exactly as they wanted. And the same logic applied really when the United States, Britain, France and other allies, including Arab countries, went and threw Saddam Hussein out of Iraq in 1990-1991 after Saddam had invaded, out of Kuwait, after Saddam had invaded Kuwait. The same reason, first of all, to protect our allies and interests over there, but also to send a message that this kind of aggression is not acceptable. So not the same enemies really, but another example of the way that sovereign nations have to react in these situations, both to protect themselves and to maintain world order. We could look also at Northern Ireland, another example where the British Army fought a 30-year campaign against IRA terrorists. And that I was involved in that campaign. I did about 7 or 8 operational tours in Northern Ireland over the years. And we were fighting there IRA terrorists who use very similar tactics to Hamas. And in fact, there has been cooperation between the IRA and Hamas, and indeed other groups, including Libya in that part of the world, both exchanging of technology and techniques in both directions. But it was different. I think you could probably compare Northern Ireland more to Judea and Samaria rather than Gaza, because in Northern Ireland, we were fighting in Northern Ireland. We were operating in Northern Ireland, whereas, of course, Gaza is, to all intents and purposes, a separate country from Israel. So it is different, but many, many similarities. And and then also you can look at British military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you talk to most British serving soldiers and retired soldiers, they have the same view of Israel, the IDF, as I do, which is probably not a common view within general British society. Maybe more so, I don't know. But it's if you listen to the BBC or Sky News, you wouldn't have that view. You would have the view probably that Israel is the bad guy in this. But if you, as I have, and if other serving people in the British Army and retired have actually fought the same kind of enemy in Iraq and Afghanistan as Hamas in Gaza, you would understand why Israel does what it does. And most British soldiers not only sympathize with Israel, but they also admire the IDF's operations in Gaza. And similar tactics, suicide bombings, use of human shields, excessive use of human shields, including young children throwing grenades at soldiers, because they knew that would give them three possible advantages. One is that the British soldier would pause before firing, because no soldier wants to shoot and kill a child, even if he does appear to be acting in an aggressive way like that with throwing a grenade that could have killed him. Secondly, it gives them the opportunity the terrorists the opportunity to launch a second attack given the pausing of the British action, which sometimes did happen. And thirdly, if the soldier kills a child, again, as with Hamas, it's a great tip for the media. So all of the, many, I won't go into detail about, there's things like, mosques, hospitals, schools being used as weapon sites. There's one example of actually a young British Jewish officer serving in the British Army called Mervis, who was killed in Afghanistan, leading his troops to deal with a situation in a school where an IED, a bomb, had been placed on the roof of that school deliberately to catch out the soldiers. And he was killed fighting against this kind of tactic. Of course, that's illegal activity actually everything that the Taliban were doing, as everything that Hamas does, is illegal. But these are just some examples of, I think, the kind of comparative conflicts that we've been involved in. And my experience has been, as Jonathan said at the beginning, my experience, I'm trying not to blow my own trumpet here, but my experience has been extensive of conflict around the world, including in the Middle East. And I look at what Israel's doing, and I look at the way that the IDF operate, and I'm able to draw comparisons between the IDF and other Western armies like the UK, the American Army, etc. And it's not easy to do that if you don't have that experience, partly because, whereas we always fight with Americans, not with them, but alongside them, shall I say. We sometimes fight with them as well, but that's normally in a pub. But we fight with other armies, and there's comparisons. You can make comparisons, see how they fight. The IDF fight on their own. They don't fight alongside other armies. They deliberately fight on their own. And therefore, it's so easy to get the wrong impression by looking purely at their activities, not looking at, the wider trends and patterns in modern day military action.
Why is it then, if Britain has been through these experiences over decades, especially most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, that large sections of British society and large sections of the British media seem to be so harsh on Israel if they know exactly what it is on behalf of the British people to be in that kind of a situation, in that kind of a war zone?
Well, soldiers aren't harsh on Israel. I mean, you will get exceptions, of course, but by and large, they're not. By and large, they understand, and as I say, they support. Those people other people like university academics, media commentators, UN officials, human rights groups, these people have never been in that situation. They don't understand it. They can't understand it. So they rely upon, should I say they rely, they're heavily influenced by a propaganda campaign. And the propaganda campaign that has been launched, that has been mounted against Israel for many, many years, originating in the Arab world, is what I would describe as being the greatest slur campaign in the history of the human race. And it's been so effective, it's been funded and resourced with vast amounts of resources, and it has persuaded people. And that's one of the factors. Another factor, of course, is that, British people, and the same goes for other civilized countries around the world, British people like an underdog. They support the underdog, and they see Hamas as the underdog and Israel as the military might Of course, that isn't true. Yes, Israel is much more powerful militarily than Hamas, but let's not forget what's behind Hamas, Iran. Iran is a powerful country. Iran has supplied Hamas with its weapons, with its missiles, with the wherewithal to manufacture missiles in Gaza, with funding and with direction. So it's not Israel versus some little terrorist group in Gaza, it's Israel versus Iran and its proxies, which include Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and Hezbollah up in the north.
Why do you think it is that people from the UK have a hard time understanding the regional threats? Because when people from the UK talk about this conflict, they talk about what's going on in Jerusalem, they talk about the Temple Mount, but nobody in the media seems to be talking, with only very few exceptions, about the influence of Iran. Why is it that Iran seems to get missed out on this when Iran is the one who's supporting Hamas both financially and in terms of with weapons and training?
Well, you get some commentators who do, but it's very few, and it doesn't really suit the agenda of many of these media organizations like the BBC and Sky. They don't want to know that sort of thing. And they probably think it's too complicated for their viewers as well. And they probably don't believe it either, because they have been imbued with propaganda. And, you know, we should be hearing from our political leaders about this. We should be hearing from them about Iran, but of course, they don't want to talk about Iran because they're currently negotiating the renewal of the nuclear deal with Iran. So they want to appease Iran, as the US do. And so they're not, you know, it was only back in, I think, 2015 or 2016 when an Iranian proxy, Hezbollah, established or tried to establish a bomb factory in London to carry out a bombing campaign in Britain. That actually was prevented by our own security services and police as a result of intelligence supplied by Israel. Did it make the media? No, it didn't. Why not? It has now, but only recently, only about a year ago. It was kept concealed because that was the time when I think it was just after the nuclear deal had been agreed, or during the time it was agreed, I forget exactly. But, you know, politicians here wanted that deal to work and didn't want to acknowledge the aggression of the country they were trying to negotiate with. So it's, you know, there are numerous other factors, but these are some of them.
We have a question from Arba Gega from UCL and Birkbeck, who asks, is there any possibility for Hamas to moderate? And does Hamas have any soft or diplomatic power beyond its military capabilities?
I mean, we obviously can't see into the future, but we do know what Hamas's charter says, and it says, I'm obviously paraphrasing because I don't have it off by heart, but Hamas's charter calls for the annihilation of the Jewish state. It calls for the destruction of Israel. It calls for that territory to be ruled by Islamic authorities, and that's quite a hard line, which is held up for many years. Quite a hard line to see softening. These are fanatics. What we're talking about here, and it's something you won't hear reported in the media, and not many commentators want to acknowledge it either, for numerous reasons. We're talking about a religious war here. The reason that ever since, well, certainly since the end of the First World War, when consideration was being given to recreating a Jewish state in the land of Palestine, which up until then had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire, was never a country called Palestine, but there was a territory sometimes called Palestine. And then after the end of the First World War, it was then ruled by Britain under League of Nations mandate. From that moment on, there were attacks on Jews. There was rejection of the idea of a Jewish homeland in that country where Jews had existed for more than 3,000 years. But it was rejected. Why? Because religiously, Muslims are not permitted to allow any non-Muslim authority over land that had previously been controlled by Muslims. That is the reality. And that the land of Palestine, now Israel, comes into that category because, you know, at various stages throughout history, it was ruled by Muslims, including when the Ottoman Empire controlled it from Ankara or from Istanbul. And so you know, this is a religious conflict. everyone involved in it isn't a religious fanatic, but it is at its roots a religious conflict. And I really can't see Hamas. I'd like to think Hamas might soften or change their line. And if they did, they'd be doing a great service to their own people. Because with a Hamas terrorist organization with its current policy running Gaza and with significant political sway across the whole Palestinian population out there, even outside Gaza, there can never be a two-state solution. For those people who want a two-state solution, it can never happen when Hamas hold that sway. It couldn't possibly come about. So only if Hamas are either taken out of the picture or significantly change their policy could there ever be a two-state solution. Maybe unlikely even if that happens, but it couldn't happen without it. So, and in terms of Hamas soft power, Hamas's soft power is really what I've been talking about, which is its influence over the world community in terms of vilifying and demonizing Israel. That's its soft power, and it does it very effectively. It's got a great deal of soft power. And you know, we shouldn't forget the IDF in the last few days has destroyed 100 kilometers of tunnels under Gaza Strip. 100 kilometers of tunnels known as the metro tunnels, built after 2014 by Hamas in order to provide shelter, a way of moving around the Gaza Strip, providing weapon storage sites, command facilities, extensively across the Gaza Strip. 100 kilometers of that, not all of it, but a lot of it, has been destroyed by the IDF. Now, every single kilometer cost a huge amount of money to build and cost lives, because they often use child laborers, many of whom die in the construction of these tunnels. So, you know, if you think about it, that money has come to Hamas largely from international humanitarian aid, including UK taxpayers' money, and it's been used on that as well as other weapons. And it's not gone into improving the lives and the welfare of the Palestinian people who so desperately need it. And where else has the money gone? Well, the money that hasn't been spent on munitions, most of it has gone into the pockets of the Hamas leaders, who are, you know, some of the wealthiest terrorists in the world, if not the wealthiest. They've embezzled huge amounts of our money and used it to enrich themselves. And that's the kind of people we're dealing with. It's tragic. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the people that have suffered most as a result of this has been Palestinian civilians, who actually deserve a great deal better than they get.
We've just had a great question here from Sarah Greenborn, who asks, an argument that has been made before, but most recently by Yuval Steinitz, MK, is that the IDF must temporarily take over Gaza to disarm Hamas, or else have these flare-ups and reactionary defense operations. If this becomes necessary, then in your view, how do you think it would be best navigated or communicated to the British public, who so often do not have a military perspective or context through which to view such developments?
Well, it's not necessarily a view that I share, I have to say. I mean, my view is that whatever policy towards Gaza the Israeli government choose to adopt is probably the right one. And I don't say that kind of burying my head in the sand, but it's the government of Israel and the IDF and the intelligence services of Israel that have the best possible perspective on Gaza and how to deal with it. And believe me, and you know, they're a democratically elected liberal government who they want what's best for Israel, for Israeli economy, for the Israeli people, and continuous rounds of conflict are not best for Israel. So starting at that premise, I think I would be quite surprised if the IDF are sent in to occupy Gaza permanently again. And I think there's really two rationales behind that. One of which is that the question really, can Israel expend so much military resources into Gaza permanently, which means vast numbers of troops inside Gaza policing it, and also no doubt taking casualties, I wouldn't be surprised, but huge resources to police the place, when Israel also has its mind on Iran again, the threat from Iran. Israel has to hold significant military resources ready to deal with Iran when it has to do so, which it probably will one day. And not just Iran itself, but Hezbollah up in the north, Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies in Syria. So I think I think to tie Israel down into that area now is probably going to be something that the Israeli government would not be looking at. And secondly, I think I kind of alluded to it, is going to cause many Israeli casualties, I think, because it will be an insurgency inside Gaza. And that insurgency will be supported from outside, of course, by Iran, but also by Western media, by Western governments in some cases, and by human rights organizations, the UN, of course. So they'll be condemned. They were praised for leaving Gaza, even though it left them open to the situation they face now. They will be condemned if they go back in. And how you present it to the British public, I don't know. I don't think it is something you can. I mean, obviously, we all know the logical arguments behind doing it, and they could be explained, but they will be attacked, and they'll be attacked very, very heavily, as being another, Israel yet again is expanding itself, taking over land that doesn't belong to it, as it's frequently and falsely accused of doing.
We have a question come in from Stefan, who asks, where does Iran fit into the factual matrix of the situation? Which I assume means, what is Iran actually physically, practically doing to support Hamas? Well,
Iran is providing, I mean, let's not forget that all around the region, Iran is provoking and fueling aggression. The proxy war going on in Yemen was incited and is supported by Iran as a means of getting at Saudi and extending Iran's influence there. Iran is extremely active in Lebanon through Hezbollah, which effectively controls Lebanon, and have lined up hundreds of thousands of missiles in Lebanon facing Israel, intended to unleash against Israel if Iran is attacked itself by either the United States or Israel. Iran is basically has kept alive the Assad regime in Syria. It's operating in the West Bank as well. It's operating in Libya. It is operating in numerous other countries, and it's just waiting. It's been working alongside the Taliban in Afghanistan, and is waiting to expand its influence there when Western forces leave Afghanistan in the near future. So this is the kind of canvas on which Iran is painted. And in terms of what it's directly doing with Hamas, it is arming it, as I mentioned before. It is providing advanced rocket systems for Hamas in some cases. It's providing the wherewithal for Hamas to manufacture their own more basic rockets, which they've manufactured thousand upon thousand inside Gaza. It's providing funding to Hamas, which is vital. And if you think about those tunnels, it may be some of the funding for those tunnels did come from Iran. They certainly provide other funding for Hamas. It provides direction to Hamas. So when it wants Hamas to do something, it will tell it to do it. And Hamas may or may not, but they've had fallouts in the past. But it certainly provides direction to them. Those are the what you call the factual matrix, I think. And just from my own previous experience when I worked for the British government in the Cabinet Office in London, I was dealing with international terrorism threats there, and I know from intelligence that I was privy to that, and it's not secret this, but it was confirmed, I think, in secret intelligence, that on occasions when Hamas, and this is going back into the early 2000s now, 2002, 3, 4, 5, etc., when Hamas decided that they had had enough for a bit and wanted to relax the pressure because of their own interests, not because they didn't want to keep on hitting at Israel, Iran would send a heavy from Hezbollah in Lebanon down to deal with it. Qasem Soleimani, of course, was instrumental in Hamas's war against Israel from Gaza. And one of his heavies would go down and stiffen up Hamas to re-encourage them to fight.
There's a great question here from Chris McPherson, which I've often wanted to ask during these sessions that we have with you, which is that Israel has had quite an interesting approach towards deterrence, which is these targeted assassinations of Hamas leaders. Have the British Army ever come across these kind of tactics, whether fighting on their own terms or in terms that the Americans employed in Iraq and Afghanistan? And if not, or if so, are these tactics effective? Does this work as a means of deterrence?
Yes, is the answer to that question. Targeted assassination. it sounds bad, but it's unfortunately it's a necessary evil that Israel has been practicing for many years. And you know, if we just take as an example the Israeli actions after the Munich Olympic massacre in 1972, Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, sent out the Mossad operatives around the world to track down and kill the people that did it. You know, that for those of you who don't know about the Munich Olympics massacre, it was a horrific event which had to be avenged. It couldn't just be let to stand. But again, for similar reasons, as I mentioned before about you know, sending a message of weakness. So it had to be avenged, and Mossad did that, and that was one of an earlier example of this kind of action. And you know, you look at the killing of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq by the United States. To my mind, I mean, some people branded that a crime, but to my mind, that was not a crime. It was a highly commendable action. That man was responsible, as well as I mentioned, for directing terrorist actions in Israel. He was responsible for directing terrorist actions all around the world, South America, elsewhere in the Middle East, London, France, Germany, all of this. And in fact, his operatives killed over 100, in fact, I think over 1,000, but certainly a very large number of American and British soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly in Iraq, with his proxies. So his death couldn't have come too soon. It was, if you compare you know, that severely damaged Iran's capability, and we have seen a reduction in Iran's capability since then. So was it worth that man's life to set back Iran's capability of killing people, mass killing around the world? I believe yes. You could look also at the Iranian nuclear scientist that was recently killed allegedly by Israel in Iran. Again, people have said that was a crime. He was actually a soldier. He was a nuclear scientist, but also a member of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So he was a combat soldier. And was his death worth setting back a nuclear program that threatens the lives of millions of people? Again, I believe yes, it was. Others may disagree, and you're entitled to do that. So I think, you know, we've seen targeted killings of Hamas operatives in Gaza over this recent conflict. I hope they've been successful. As to Britain, interestingly, one of the reasons that Britain had problems at one stage in sharing some intelligence, Britain and Israel have one of the greatest intelligence relationships between any two countries. We share huge amounts of intelligence, and the only other country that sort of is equally party to all this intelligence is the United States of America. People talk about the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. Actually, the Three Eyes Intelligence Alliance of Britain, Israel, and the United States is probably even more powerful than the Five Eyes. So, but we had a problem with the possibility of our intelligence potentially being used in targeted assassinations, which we considered illegal. So we restricted some of the intelligence we were sharing. But then when the situation changed, that was before things got really bad in Iraq and Afghanistan. When the situation changed, and of course with the Islamic State, the rise of them in Syria and Iraq, then we also changed our minds on targeted assassination. Because, you know, as in so many of these situations, if you personally become involved in something which becomes personally dangerous, and I say personally, I'm talking about for the country, then you tend to have a different view from others who you can hold at arm's length.
We've just had another question in about Hezbollah and the activities in the north of Israel. Today we've had reports of rocket fire from there. We had a few days ago more reports of rocket fire, and Israel's returning artillery fire at the moment, although it's widely believed that these are originating in Palestinian refugee camps and not from Hezbollah themselves. The question is following your report on Hezbollah, is Israel and the international community aware that the current conflict may foreshadow future hostilities in Lebanon? And if such a conflict with Hezbollah does break out, what do you think it would look like?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think the as I understand, I don't know where the rockets came from that have been fired from Lebanon during this conflict. Whether they came, I've heard reports that they came from Palestinian militias up there rather than from Hezbollah, but I don't know that, of course. What I do know is that the Lebanese government, which is hugely influenced by Hezbollah and Hezbollah itself, both of those two together, are responsible for anything that happens like that, any aggression towards Israel that comes from Lebanon. And you know, in the same way as Hamas, which rules Gaza, is responsible for everything that happens in Gaza and all aggression out of Gaza. So, you know, I would say whoever actually fired it, Hezbollah and the Lebanese government are responsible for that and need to make sure it doesn't happen. And if it does continue to happen, then Israel is, of course, perfectly justified in carrying out attacks against infrastructure in Lebanon that is being used to fire these missiles. I think one other thing I'd like to mention on the Lebanon Hezbollah, there's two others actually. One is that I'm sure that you've probably seen it in the media, I'm sure most people, the extraordinary, spectacularly successful Israeli airstrike against these metro tunnels that I mentioned before, under Gaza, that occurred last Thursday night as a result of a direct deception operation in which mass Israeli armor tanks and infantry assembled on the border with Gaza, which was obviously picked up by Hamas and also by the international media, who reported it as an imminent invasion. That caused Hamas fighters, I think in their hundreds, to rush into the tunnels. And immediately Israel then carried out a bombing raid against those targets using 160 aircraft, dropping JDAM bunker busting bombs over a 40-minute period. That in itself is a spectacular military achievement, to coordinate so many aircraft in such a short space, in such a small space, in such a short space of time. Now that would certainly have sent a message to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're not sitting there ignoring what's going on in Gaza. That would have been I think, a deterrent message to them, and it would have given them pause for thought, as well as the follow-up attacks that have taken place in the tunnel since. But as to what the conflict in Lebanon is going to look like in the future, and I think it's I wouldn't say it's an inevitability, but it's a possibility, certainly quite a strong one. And I mentioned that the reason those missiles are deployed in southern Lebanon pointing at Israel is in case they're intended to be used in case Israel or the US carry out an attack against Iran, when they would effectively be the counterfire to that attack. They may be used in other circumstances as well. But there are thousands of missiles there. They're embedded in communities, in population centers, in villages and houses. Most houses in that part of Lebanon have a sitting room, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a rocket room. And they're heavily defended and protected. So even if you attack them from the ground, they're tough nuts to crack. And if you attack them from the air, you guarantee you're going to kill civilians. There's no question about that. And they're deliberately designed to do that. So if an attack is necessary by Israel, a counterattack is necessary, if Hezbollah does unleash these missiles on Iran's orders, most likely, then there will have to be a massive air operation initially against the parts of Lebanon where these missiles are in. It will have to be overwhelming, because these missiles are hugely numerous and they have long range in some cases, and they have to be stopped, and I think stopped very quickly. That would mean, and it would be legal, it would be lawful, it would not be against international law, but it would result in a civilian bloodbath in southern Lebanon. And that is why, I mentioned this before, but that is why it's so important that, and I'm being optimistic when I say it could happen, but it should be so important that the media, United Nations, political leaders, human rights groups condemn what Hamas is doing in Gaza and support the IDF in what they're trying to do to prevent it. Because failure to do that not only encourages more aggression from Hamas, it also encourages Hezbollah. They will have looked at the way Israel's dealt with it, yes, and that will have provided some form of deterrent, but they will also be looking at the reactions of the international community, which will encourage them in doing that. And I think I would guess, when you ask what kind of shape it's going to take, I would guess that a conflict of this sort in southern Lebanon will make the current conflict in Gaza look like a pub fight on a Saturday night.
Yeah, quite. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador Gold, who's joined us in the midst of that answer, and quite on the point. Just make sure, can you hear us all right? We're good on the audio, Ambassador?
I hear you very clearly.
Fantastic. Well, straight on to this topic, looking at the broader implications of this, have the Abraham Accords borne fruit in relation to diplomacy surrounding this conflict with Hamas? And how important are the Abraham Accords in relation to Israel's diplomatic attempts to handle crises, for example, the one that we're dealing with at the moment?
Well, there's something you should notice and take note of, and that is Israel's diplomatic relations with all the countries of the Abraham Accords. And in addition to those which are not formally, but they started at about the same time. Those relations have continued. It isn't as though somebody said, you know what, ask your ambassador to leave and have him come back when the war is over. That's not how they're operating. These many countries in the Gulf in particular look at Hamas, which by its charter is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They view the Muslim Brotherhood as in adversarial terms. And therefore, Israel is currently fighting their enemy. It is true, Hamas is a Palestinian organization, and the Palestinian cause has traditionally been a subject that in many countries in the Arab world, there's a certain identification with it. But the spread of the Muslim Brotherhood is something that these countries oppose. Finally, Hamas, if you go back to 2003, 2004, go back even a little earlier, the 1990s, Hamas was chiefly supported by Saudi Arabia. But today, the Saudis do not give a penny to Hamas. So who provides the weaponry being used against Israel? Who's paying for those missiles? Well, it's not a surprise. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that vast infrastructure and military planning has been encouraged by the Quds Force of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So these are the enemies of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and all the countries of the Gulf. Even Qatar is not thrilled with them, although they've been helping Hamas, particularly the civilian side of Hamas. So I think the Abraham Accords showed that these countries are finding their common ground with Israel. And that common ground, once this war is over, is likely to expand.
We have a question here for you, Ambassador, from Alexander at Cambridge. He asks, why is the Biden administration and European allies, including the United Kingdom, pushing for a new nuclear deal with Iran? This is in spite of the fact that Iran bankrolls all of the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants, as well as terrorists in Lebanon, Yemen, and Syria. How can we prevent a new nuclear deal?
Well, I think the problem with Iran and negotiations with Iran under present circumstances is made of two elements. Certainly the nuclear part, because the Iranians violated the JCPOA from 2015. The Iranians have been moving ahead with enriching uranium up to 60%. That's well beyond the limits that were put there by the original Iran deal. But the real problem for many countries in the Middle East is Iran's involvement in malign activities of its militias. And these militias can be Sunni militias or they can be Shiite militias. And, you know, it's very interesting. There was a perception, and maybe it was a marketing point back in 2015, that if the Iran deal is done, Iran will pull back from a lot of its support for these jihadi militias in the Middle East. It'll withdraw its backing. Well, that didn't happen. The exact opposite occurred. The amount of support Iran gave to its various militias across the Middle East increased dramatically. Now, that also was encouraged by the fact that Iran received a huge amount of money. Now, if these negotiations with Iran go forward, the first thing that's going to happen, because this is something which Iran will insist upon, is that the sanctions that were put in place by Mr. Trump, and even before Mr. Trump, those sanctions will be removed. And a huge amount of money, of dollars, will come available for the Iranian regime, which is why they're going to negotiate, to get that money. And it's going to put a lot of governments and a lot of people at risk across the Middle East.
Why do you think it is that President Biden is pursuing this policy if all evidence points to the fact that Iran is not really interested in bringing back its involvement in other countries and sparking wars and funding proxy forces?
Well, sometimes governments pursue a line of policy because the belief that it is a wise option becomes widespread in society. I remember after 9/11, there were many American intellectuals who would write op-eds in the New York Times who started saying, you know, our problem in the Middle East are not the Shiites of Iran. Our problem are the Sunni radicals of Saudi Arabia. And therefore, we're on the wrong side. We should become allies of Iran, and we should attack the Sunni radicals in the Gulf. This spread like wildfire. And I am sure President Obama was affected by those who were purveyors of this thinking. Now, why did this occur? Did this occur because some new information came out that caused this kind of sea change in intellectual currents in Washington? No. But the idea gained currency and strength, and therefore, captured the imagination of policymakers at the time. It set the stage for the Iran deal. So I think that still is a problem when Mr. Zarif goes on American talk shows and charms somewhat fooled interviewers with respect to Iranian intentions. That still continues. And the only way to combat that fairly is to expose Western audiences, whether in the UK or in the United States, to the evidence we've accumulated showing the dangerous positions Iran is taking. Last point here, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the UK, has a think tank, and it has released a brilliant study on Iranian militias, and he raises many of these points. So I think we have to find allies in the UK, in Israel, in America, in the Gulf states, and study the issues, get the information out, and expose what Iran is up to as many people as we can.
I have a question for you, Colonel. I often like to ask this to guests who come, especially from different backgrounds, and with a lot of our students being based in the UK, I like to ask it to people who are also British, which is why, or even should, British citizens care about what's going on with Israel and Hamas? Why should they care?
I thought I was off the hook now that Ambassador Gold appeared on the scene, but obviously not. It's very good to see you, by the way, Dore. Great pleasure. Been too long.
Likewise. Likewise.
Why should the British care? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is historical. Britain is probably the one country in the world that was more responsible than any other for the state of Israel being recreated in 1948. And that emanates from, first of all, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in which the British Foreign Secretary issued a statement supporting the establishment of Jewish national homeland in that land, followed up by the British Armed Forces defeating the Ottomans. If it hadn't been for that defeat of the Ottomans in 1917, 1918, then who's to say there could possibly be a land of Israel today? You know, maybe the Ottomans or the Turks would still be ruling that part of the world. So those two things, I think, were fundamental. And the Balfour Declaration wasn't only a British declaration, it also had the support of the most important countries in the world that we weren't fighting against at the time. And after that, of course, Britain then ran that part of the world through its mandate given to it by the League of Nations. And British involvement from the kind of, probably from the 1920s, 1930s onwards, was not covered in glory on Israel, right up until and after the re-establishment of the State of Israel. But nevertheless, historically speaking, Britain does have a strong interest in Israel. And today, the interests are many. Obviously, trade. Israel is an important trading partner for Britain. I mentioned earlier the extent of intelligence cooperation between Britain and Israel, which has kept many, many British people alive today who would otherwise be dead on the streets of London and in the fields of Afghanistan and elsewhere. The same goes for other elements of Israeli military technology and battlefield medical technology. So all of these things are important to Britain. I think perhaps of greatest importance, however, is the fact that Israel is fighting on the front lines of a struggle that is facing the world today. And I mentioned earlier on about the importance of the right message being sent out, the right stand being taken, for example, in the Falklands War and in the Kuwait-Iraq War in 1990, 1991, the first Gulf War. And Israel is on the front line of this fight that we all face. And I'm a member of a group called the Friends of Israel Initiative, chaired by Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada, previously chaired by Jose Maria Aznar, the former President of Spain. And President Aznar said, he wrote an article in which he said, if Israel goes down, we all go down. And I believe that to be true. And in addition to that fight they're conducting to an extent on our behalves, obviously that's not their primary reason for doing it, it's the defense of their own country. But if you look at the entire problems in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel's stand there, Israel's security operations there, Israel's support for countries like Egypt and Jordan and other countries have, I think, severely reduced the very likely much higher immigration flow into Europe that we would see from those areas. So those are some of the reasons why we should care. There are plenty of other ones which I won't bore you with now because I want to hear more of what Ambassador Gold's got to say.
Well, I do want to repeat the question to Ambassador Gold, but I have received a question and I have to ask the questions that I've received. So I've got a question from Jenny from IDF Herzliya, who wants to understand what Iran has to gain by funding all of these militia groups across the Middle East. And then maybe I could get you to answer the question, why should citizens of Western countries care about Israel at all?
So let's start with the Iranian funding, what I call malign activities across the Middle East. Well, go to the Iranian Constitution that was adopted in 1979 when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. That constitution called for the export of the Iranian Revolution around the world, starting in the Islamic world. And it wasn't just the Shiites, it was also to include the Sunnis. So when the Iranian Revolutionary Guards are following the export of the revolution and fulfilling Ayatollah Khomeini's original request of his people. That's the essence of the Iranian regime. That's who they are. They are ideologically driven. By the way, as Hamas is ideologically driven, and as Hamas follows its 1988 covenant. So it's hard for us to believe that people can do that. You know, we assume mostly that people just want to have a good life, come home from a hard day of work, get a beer, put up their feet in front of the television and relax. Well, not if you're a true believer in the Iranian Revolution. That's not what you do. And not if you're a true believer in the Hamas covenant. And these guys are out to destroy us. They want to destroy Israel. They want to destroy the regimes in the Middle East. And eventually they want to threaten you.
And in relation to the second question, why do you think citizens of Western European and American countries, why should they care about Israel?
Well, if we speak in security terms, you know, beside, you know, people being affected by religious sentiments, but if we speak in security terms, these organizations that I mentioned in the Middle East now have offshoots all over Europe. You know, I won't go into too much detail, but I will never forget sitting with the leaders of a Middle Eastern country in New York City. And I asked them, so where are we going to have our follow-up meeting? You know, I said, why don't we do it in Rome, or why don't we do it in Berlin, where it's closer to you, it's closer to us. It's not like flying all the way to New York City. You know what they said? They said, today, Europe is under the influence of radical Islamic groups, and it's dangerous. So let's go back to America. Now, what is going on here? Somebody was sleeping at the wheel, and they allowed a massive immigration to come into Europe, and they also allowed extremist groups to come into Europe. I remember the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, used to run seminars in France at a big castle. Why is that? Why was that allowed to happen? So you have some serious problems in Europe with these radical organizations. They're more threatened, and this is more dangerous, in fact, than what we face in Israel. And now they're saying on Israeli television tonight, in particular Ehud Yari, one of our greatest Arab affairs analysts, that no matter what the Americans and the Europeans say, they cannot allow Hamas to perceive that it was victorious in this war, in any way or in any possible way. Why? Because if Hamas feels that, and if other friendly jihadi groups have that perception, even if it's totally false, then Western states will be increasingly threatened from within. He didn't say that, I'm saying that. And so therefore you have a direct interest in following what's going on in the Middle East and following what we're up to. And by the way, many of the sort of know-nothing announcers who go on television will try and project an image of brute Israeli power and brute Israeli strength, refusing to report the elaborate methods used by Israel to minimize the threat to innocent people. That is how we wage our wars. We feel we are morally in the right. We feel that we are driven by intention to end the conflict, not to exacerbate it. And that makes us very different from the other side. So it's a long way forward. And even if there is some kind of ceasefire in the next 3 to 4 days, the conflict will not be over. But we will protect the people of Israel. We'll protect our allies, not just our Western allies like the British, but we'll protect our Arab allies. And we will work together to make a more secure future. And I'm not just pontificating, I'm telling you what has to be done.
We have a question for you, Colonel, which has just popped up on the questions chat, which is from Yossi, who asks, do you think it's possible to destroy totally the military capabilities of Hamas?
Well, I kind of touched on that, I think, in an earlier question, speaking about, which was about going into Gaza and reoccupying Gaza. And I would suspect that something like that is about the only way of doing it. But of course, it's not a price I don't think that Israel would like to pay at the moment to repossess Gaza. But that is probably the only way you could actually really prevent this kind of thing flaring up again. But of course, it would at the same time be flaring up on a pretty perpetual basis inside Gaza anyway, against the large number of IDF forces that would be required to be there. Short of that, I think I'm sure that the IDF has significantly degraded Hamas's capabilities over the last few days. I think they've hit them very, very hard, not just those tunnels, but in numerous other target areas. They've hit them. They've hit their command structure. They've hit their intelligence structure. They've hit their weapon, their fighting capabilities, and hit it very hard. And I think, you know, my view when we talk about ceasefires or otherwise, well, you know, I believe it's wrong for the United States, Britain, and Britain's already, British Foreign Ministry has come out today urging a ceasefire. I think it's wrong. We all want to see a ceasefire, of course we do. We don't want to see any more of this fighting and killing. But I think it's wrong to try and pressure Israel into stopping now if the government of Israel does not feel that it is time to stop. Because I think the most important thing is not looking at this conflict, but looking at the next conflict. And therefore, Israel should be the ones that decide how much more destruction they need to do of Hamas in Gaza in order to both deter them from further conflict and deny them their military capability of doing so. And that's not something that President Biden can judge, or Prime Minister Johnson, or anybody else outside Israel. It's only something that can be judged by the government of Israel. But so, you know, and the answer really to the question, I suppose, is that there will come a time when there is a ceasefire, before too much longer, probably. I don't know. We can't see the future, but and I would only hope that in that between the beginning of this conflict and then, that the IDF has succeeded in seriously degrading Hamas's capabilities to the extent that they will be deterred and prevented from further operations again, you know, from the next round, at least for a few years, which is what's occurred before. Now, the other thing just to mention is that Hamas, wherewithal, I mean, many of the missiles that Hamas use are made in Gaza, but the wherewithal comes from outside, and some of the more advanced missiles come from Iran, either directly or indirectly. And of course, Israel attempts to prevent that happening through its sea blockade and through its land blockades. But nothing like that can be impenetrable. There's always a way to get through. And one of the problems, of course, with this is that so many in the international community, in the UN, in the EU, in human rights groups, in the media, condemn Israel for effectively isolating Gaza. In other words, for carrying out action to prevent these stores getting into Gaza and weapons getting into Gaza that will eventually lead to more bloodshed. So again, it's an area where I think that the Western world must take responsibility to an extent for for the build-up of weapons in Gaza. And indeed, the Western world, you know, the US, Britain, European navies, etc., should take responsibility for assisting Israel in policing this situation.
Well, on that, we have a question from an anonymous attendee, and it's directed towards the ambassador. And in spirit with asking the hard questions and getting the good answers, it asks, why should free countries like Britain or America ally themselves with either brutal theocracies or indeed with the permanent occupation of Palestinians, by which I assume they mean with Israel?
Well, this person obviously has a perspective, to put it diplomatically, but it's an incorrect perspective. The permanent occupation of Palestinians. If tomorrow a legitimate Palestinian government wanted to negotiate with the state of Israel, the emergence of self-rule, of some kind of Palestinian self-governing entity in borders that Israel can live with, we would do it. And the only reason it hasn't happened is because of the Palestinian political leadership. I don't know if you're aware of this. In 2014, Secretary of State John Kerry was working tirelessly to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, came up with a plan that allowed both sides to have reservations from the plan while approving the plan. He brought Mahmoud Abbas and the plan to the Oval Office to see President Obama. And President Obama said, look, Netanyahu has approved this peace proposal. Can I get your opinion? Can you also approve it? And then we'll be on the, sort of on the fast track to ending the Arab-Israel conflict. So what did Mahmoud Abbas say? I'll get back to you. And he never did. So I'm telling you that story because if people start talking about permanent occupation being a feature of Israel's foreign policy, having been the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that is utter rubbish. And we are not interested in permanently occupying anybody. We would like to reach a peace treaty with all our neighbors.
We have another question asked to you, Ambassador, which is the Chinese and the Russians are close allies with Iran. Can we see either of their hands in the rising tension, and do they profit from the destabilization of the Middle East?
Well, I was in Moscow many times, and I worked with the Russian government. Diplomacy does not involve getting into a room where you've agreed on everything and you have nothing to do but sip on vodka. That is not the way it works. Diplomacy involves oftentimes engaging with countries where you have a large degree of disagreement, but you try and close the gaps and you try to bring about a better, more stable result. I will never forget one time we had a Russian delegation come to Jerusalem, and we had just found in Hamas headquarters the kind of booklet about Hamas's friendships in the jihadi world, which included organizations that were fighting the Russian army. So, of course, we made this booklet available to President Putin and his staff. So we can find some common ground with them, although we have disagreed many times with Russian policy. And in Syria, we don't have a particularly positive view of strengthening the Syrian regime, or certainly strengthening Iran. But we can find a basis for working with them. The same is true with the Chinese, although we have to be very careful with China because China sees itself as the new superpower. In diplomacy, you have to work with everybody. Just be very careful and make sure nobody is pickpocketing you in the middle of it.
Fantastic. And the final question I'll put to both of you, which is that is there a link between the rising anti-Semitism that we've seen across Europe these past few weeks and the increase of Islamic extremism that we've also been witnessing? Are they one and the same, or are they separate issues entirely? I'll start you off with the ambassador. Yeah.
Pardon?
I'll let you answer first.
Well, thank you. Look, rising anti-Semitism is a very big problem. It hurts me deeply to see fellow Jews in France scared to death because of threats against the community. Well, I have to say, when Jeremy Corbyn was the head of the British Labour Party, I was saying, well, what happened to the Britain I knew? That guy is bad news, and he's a threat to my people. So, you know, what can I say? The rise of anti-Semitism is serious. Some of it comes from the radical Muslims. Some of it comes from, you know, ignorant leftist groups that are pushing an anti-Israel line. But, you know, we should not be intimidated by it. We have to stand firm and fight it. First, fight it intellectually. Prove our points and get out there and say them. And that's what I do. I am looking forward to being able to travel again in Europe post COVID, and to lecture and to demonstrate to people what the real truth of the Middle East is. I'll stop here.
I would say that as a non-Jew, I feel equally. Sorry, can I speak? Ben?
Yeah, I was just turning to you.
Okay. As a non-Jew, I feel equally upset at the fact that Jews in this country and other European countries in the 21st century are being terrified by anti-Semites. And we only have to look a couple of days ago in London, in parts of London where there's a higher than average Jewish population, at a motorcade driving through that area with a tannoy, shouting, encouraging people to rape Jews and their daughters. Now, that is not Israelis, Jews, and this was part of this was covered in Palestinian flags, and it purported to be a sort of Hamas solidarity, Palestinian solidarity type action, but actually it was very clearly naked anti-Semitism. Now, I'm happy to say that 4 arrests were made by the Metropolitan Police after that action. We also saw in Chigwell, near London, we saw a rabbi beaten up the same day as that occurred. And no doubt there have been plenty of other instances of intimidation and violence around London. And I think what we shouldn't believe is that this is to do with Israel. It's not really to do with Israel. The Palestinian Solidarity Commission in the UK, PSC, is an anti-Semitic group. It purports to be supporting Palestinians, but actually it works to silence Jews, to drive Jews out, to intimidate Jews. That's what it wants. That's what it tries to achieve. And that goes for the entire BDS movement. The BDS movement have had no effect on Israel, as far as I can see, whatsoever, and is going to have no effect on Israel whatsoever. It hasn't negatively affected the economy. But it does have a big effect on Jews in this country and other countries because it targets them, and it targets Jewish businesses as well. So, you know, I think we're looking here when we recent flare up in anti-Semitic attacks in the UK is essentially using the events in Gaza as an excuse. I don't think they're really. If you ask the average person who's driving around London waving Palestinian flags, usually upside down, or parading around a football field as a member of the Manchester United team, as we saw a day or so ago, again with the flag upside down. They care so much for Palestine, they don't even know which way the flag flies. But if you ask them to pinpoint Israel or Palestine or Israel or Gaza on a map, they won't be able to find it. They don't know where it is. It's an excuse, I think, in many cases. There are obviously exceptions to that. But those people who tell me that anti-Zionism is something different from anti-Semitism, I'm afraid are mistaken. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism are one and the same thing. And very often anti-Zionism is an excuse to be anti-Semitic in your own country.
Well, I think we have just hit the time limit that I've been provided with. So it's now my great privilege of thanking both of you for joining us this evening, Ambassador Dore Gold and Colonel Richard Kemp. I also want to thank everyone who's come as an observer. For all those who've asked questions, we really appreciate it. And please do continue to follow us as we discuss the key issues with the key players and key observers, insights that you will not get very many places elsewhere. So thank you very much for joining us, Ambassador and Colonel, and I wish everyone watching a wonderful evening.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
A great pleasure.